Our goal for today is just to get you thinking about the organizational structure and the potentials of that structure. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Truth Talks, the podcast that brings you real strategies for sustainable fitness transformation. Now, today we're going to be addressing, I think, what is one of the most common questions when you first start working out or start lifting, and that's how many days a week should you actually be training? So let me start out with this. Paris, how many days a week do you currently train?
Right now, I train 5 days a week.
5 days a week. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm 4 days a week.
Yeah. But what's interesting is when I first started training, I trained like 7 days a week. Then I went to 6 days a week. Then I went to 5. Then for like the past 3-ish years, I've been training 4 days a week, even through all the competition preps. And then recently we just jumped it up to 5, just because there's certain muscle groups I want to bring up that require a little bit more volume. And I just kind of reprioritized, things in my week. So it's kind of fluctuated, but I would say it's come down over time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like my experience is kind of similar. You actually wrote my first programs for me, I think. You kind of got me started on more structured training. And when I started mostly when I was in university, and I was kind of going to the gym, like same thing, like 6-7 days a week. I think sometimes I would even go and just do abs for the day or whatever, but I was in the gym way more often than I am now. It is a bit of a privilege to be like, oh, now I'm actually more intentional with how I train and how much I train. And I think at that time in my life, I just didn't have as much going on. I was kind of like studying or in the gym. And now there's a lot of these other responsibilities, work stuff, home life, friends,
100%.
Exploring a city, right? Like there's tons of other stuff going on. So I'm now actually really appreciative for my 4 days a week of training.
I think honestly, 4 is a really good sweet spot. I think for most people, if you're a little bit more serious, I do, and especially if you're trying to build like an overall well-balanced physique, I do think 5 it can be better, especially for competitors or whatever. But on average, I think 4 is like an amazing sweet spot, and especially balancing like recovery and everything like that, but also mostly from a lifestyle management perspective, while still having that balance of like good training volume, but also lifestyle management.
So, I mean, we could end the podcast there because you just answered the question.
Yeah.
But we're not going to.
Yeah.
So we heard that the sweet spot is 4. But what we're going to do today is actually explore a little bit more around how you can determine the best for you number of days of training, and kind of considering, okay, we still want things to be effective for your goals, but what are the different factors you need to consider? And then what kind of splits might you consider based on the number of days a week that you're training? And what that means is essentially, how do you then organize, muscle groups across the week based on the number of days that you're in the gym? Does that sound good?
That sounds good.
Okay. Before we actually dive into the practical stuff, I do want to kind of rehash a little bit of why we're talking about this today. And I think it's just because there's so much noise out there around programming. And it starts with like 2 things in my mind. And then I'm going to ask you if there's anything else you want to add. The first is you have all these, let's call them fitfluencers, who like have made the gym their life and they're training 5-6 days a week. Or if they're not, they're making it seem like they are. And so that kind of says to people, oh, you need to kind of be in the gym every day to kind of get this physique. And so I think part of what we're trying to do today is actually break that down and be like, you don't have to be in the gym every day. That would be the first thing. And I think the second thing is just like, when we're getting started with something, we want to make sure we're doing enough. Like, am I doing this right? And so sometimes that might also encourage us to like do more than we need to. So hopefully today we can help streamline that and be like, this is the reality.
Yeah, I think so. And you know what? We talked about this in the other episodes, but like really making sure that your training is effective and efficient and having a plan, you can get away with less days than you think. And you got to remember, if you're somebody who is just starting out, you don't need that big of a stimulus to make changes, because anything above what you're doing right now, which is nothing, is something that's going to stimulate changes in your body, right? So if you're coming off a 0-day split, even 2 days a week, you 2 full body days or something, you would see progress for a little bit,
Absolutely. So you kind of got to know where you're at and then build your way up from there. Okay, so one other thing that I want to preface before, again, I always know I have all these like, niche ideas I got to bring forward before we dive into it, but I want to say it. One of the things that is really important in this conversation is to recognize that daily movement is important. Like, we do ideally want to be engaging in some form of movement every day, But what we're talking about in this episode is how many times a week should you be resistance training specifically. So that is not to say like, okay, if you work out 3 times a week, don't do anything the rest of the week. That's not what we're here to say. What we're talking about specifically is if you are following a resistance training program, how many days a week should you be in the gym?
Yeah, good.
Okay, cool. So with that caveat in mind, let's dive in. Quick answer to the question. How many days a week should you be training? What would it be?
Probably somewhere between 3 and 5 sessions per
Okay,
week.
great.
I have very rarely programmed 6 day per week split, and for the couple individuals I have, we ended up scaling back to 5 when they learned how to train more effectively and train properly.
Mm-hmm.
Like majority of people cannot recover from 6 hard training sessions per week unless you're really like spreading out your training volume very small amounts of volume per session. But even then, it's just, even just thinking about, you have to pack your stuff, go to the gym, come back, shower, making it like it's even just a big kind of interference in the day. There's some mental fatigue along with that. And anywhere below 3 days per week, unless you're an absolute beginner, it's very hard to really make a ton of momentum on only 2 sessions a week. You can, but it doesn't mean, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And you probably see better progress with 3 to 5.
Okay, so 3 to 5 means that people essentially have 3 options: 3, 4, or 5 days a week. I'd love to talk a little bit about the factors that can help somebody decide how many days, 3, 4, or 5, feels suitable to them. So let's
Mhm.
unpack that a little bit and discuss, before we even say this is right for 3, this is right for 4, this is right for 5, let's just talk generally about, okay, these are the factors you should be considering when you are talking about how many days a week you want to be in the gym.
Yeah. The first one is, instead of asking yourself what is the best program, ask yourself how many days can I train? And what is realistic for me to stick to? Because you might be like, oh, you know what? I'm just going to go right to 5 day split and it's going to be great. But realistically, if that is very stressful for you to try to balance 5 sessions a week, and maybe you have somebody that is commuting or has kids or works long hours or has unpredictability in their schedule or does traveling, maybe it's a lot to ask for a 5 day split. And maybe theoretically you could see like maybe slightly better progress, but maybe if you went to 3 or 4, you would still see great progress and you would be able to stick to it consistently with less stress. And you wouldn't have these periods of time where you're going all in and then you like fall
Mm-hmm.
off for a bit and then you feel bad about it and then you try again. It's like set yourself up for success with what's realistic to fit into your schedule.
So it starts with your own schedule.
Yeah.
And for most people, I would say, our schedules do kind of revolve around work, family, social commitments type
Mm-hmm.
thing, right? So if you think about, you made a great example of commuting. Let's say you're a hybrid worker and you're in the office 2 days a week. You can start by saying, okay, is it realistic for me to be training on the days where I have a longer commute? No? Okay. We know we've got 5 days left in the week. How many of those could we now be training? Actually use like a process of elimination, I think, is really helpful to determine how many days you can train, because sometimes there are commitments that naturally mean that you're not training on a certain day of the week, right? And so then you can figure out, okay, with what I'm left with, how many days a week can I realistically train based on my schedule?
Yeah. And it's also something to think about is what season of life you're at, because maybe sometimes for a certain season, your life's a bit more stable and you're like, okay, 5 days, great. But then other times, maybe you're doing a lot of traveling for work or you're moving or something. Maybe that's the time when we go to a 3 day split, or you got a newborn or something and your sleep is kind of off. Why would we give ourselves 5 hard days to train? We're not going to recover if we're not sleeping. So it's just kind of knowing what phase of life you're in and then how much of a priority the training is based on the season of life.
I do like how you framed it around how much of a priority, because that priority does shift over time.
Yes.
And it's not to say that you stop caring about your fitness goals. It's just you're adapting to where they suit a variety of priorities, because it's not like being in the gym is your whole life. And so knowing how to adapt is really important, and it's not on or off. You're not either, hey, I'm on board or I'm off. So that's where being able to scale up or down within the 3 to 5 becomes really important. And knowing how to scale up or down is really important, because it'll keep you engaged somehow, rather than falling for that, hey, I'm on, hey, I'm off.
Yeah, I agree.
Amazing.
I like it.
So one of the other things I wanted to kind of bring up in the context of factors for you to consider is your training level. And I think you did allude to this a little bit earlier on, but let's specifically outline it. If you are a beginner, you said, hey, you might even get away with 2 days, kind of more 3. If you are more advanced, you might benefit from having additional sessions. Can you unpack that a little bit further and explain why there's such a nuance there?
Yeah, there's the thing called like newbie gains, right? When you're kind of a noob, and you can compare this to any skill development in life or anything in life. When you first start learning something, you're going to be able to learn very quickly and progress very quickly compared to when you're already somewhat of a quote unquote master, we'll say, or you've already done a lot of that. It's going to be tougher to have the same rate of progress, and you'll need like a higher dose, we'll say, in order to see additional progress or gains in that avenue, right? So if you're just starting, like you can go to a 5 or 6 day split, you could, but you really don't need to. And maybe your volume requirements of like how many working sets you have per week per muscle is going to be significantly lower. So if you're first starting, I would recommend definitely a 3 maybe 4 day split for sure. And then you kind of eke out what you can with that for as long as possible.
Mhm. And the reason that you can kind of go up from there, I think, as well, when you become more advanced, might also be because you start to focus more specifically on, okay, this is a muscle group I want to bring up. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to add more volume because,
Yes.
that dose response kind of thing you just talked about. So part of it is along the process of learning how your body responds and then being able to add an amount of specificity to your training that might benefit from, okay, I'm going to distribute my volume in a different way, and that you don't need to do that as a beginner.
Also, something to think about though is like you might be very advanced, but maybe you don't care about certain muscle groups. Like the only reason I really jump up to 5 day splits because I've never really prioritized like my legs before. I've always trained them hard, but I've never prioritized them. But now, in
Mm-hmm.
order to prioritize them along with still growing what else I want to grow, I need that extra day to kind of evenly spread my training volume, especially for such a hefty like muscle group.
Yeah.
But let's say I didn't care about legs at all, and I'm still advanced. I could rock even a 3 day split and just do bare minimum just to maintain whatever. Like it's up to you depending on what kind of physique you want. But for overall physique development is kind of what we're saying here. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so then the other factor that I think is important, we actually talked about this in a little bit in our previous episode on how can you save time in the gym.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll link that up here in the cards and in the description below. But part of it is your desired session length,
Mm-hmm.
because we talked about it in that episode, but I'm going to bring it back here because it's still relevant. When you are somebody who's like, I want to go to the gym and spend longer sessions on fewer days a week, okay, maybe you're doing 3 sessions, right? But if you're someone who's like, I don't have a lot of time on the days I can make it there, but I can make it to the gym more often, then you might be closer to a 5 day split, but then each of your sessions is shorter in length.
Shorter. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. And that we can definitely think about things like that. And it's kind of like how you want to spread your training volume over the week, right? You have this much training volume. What's a logical way to spread it? You can only go so far in either direction, right? You're not going to go like to the gym for 3 hours because by the end of the session it's not going to be good quality volume. So it's not like, okay, let me just stack all my volume in one day. Like it doesn't work like that. But generally we can kind of say what Courtney said.
Absolutely. Okay, we got one more factor here, which you have alluded to a few times, but I'm just giving it that final punch. Recovery. Knowing how your body will naturally recover does have a role to play with your training frequency. And if you are somebody who trains really, really hard and maybe doesn't have other recovery variables in check, like sleep, or different nutrition protocols, or
Stress
stress,
management. Yeah.
yeah, stress management, then you might benefit from training fewer days a week, just to make sure that you're not entering into sessions like back to back totally unrecovered.
Hmm. This is a big one. And also, there's so much individual variation, even with like how much volume you can handle, recover from, and progress with. There are some people who can handle significant amounts of volume and still be good and wake up and get after it the next day. And other people, could be on half the volume and be like, whoa, this is like enough for me type thing. So you really got to play around with that. But I would say most people on average do too many sets per week and don't have good enough sets.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like the first thing to do is like, let's optimize the sets we have. And that's why I think it's good to start with maybe a 3 or 4 day split and, medium volume, and then just hammer it, get really, really good at training and have high quality sessions and high quality sets, know how to train properly. And then you can think about adding volume or adding days.
Right, right. So volume definitely has a relationship with recovery. So once you kind of get your volume in check, which corresponds to kind of how many days you're training as well, that can really help you make sure you're entering each session more recovered. I think the other thing I'd be remiss if I didn't mention is, depending on your priority muscle groups,
Mm-hmm.
your rate of recovery could be different.
Yes.
We find all the time, you and I have talked about this, Hamstrings, just they take so long to recover. So
Yeah.
if you're somebody who's like, I'm hammering my hamstrings, like they're priority for me, then you may need more recovery time between sessions. But if you're somebody who's like trying to build your biceps, it's like, okay, and biceps are a priority, you might train them more often because they recover faster. Do you have any other factors you want to throw out there as like these are considerations that you should keep in mind when you're determining how many days a week to train?
I think we covered that pretty well. Yeah.
Okay, amazing. So if we were to just say, when does 3 training sessions a week make sense? Can we just spitball bullet points? Train 3 days a week
If you're newer, for sure. If you're a busy person, for sure. And if maybe you don't care as much about certain muscle groups and you care about very specific muscle groups exclusively. And some are like, I don't really care about these, you know?
So if you are maybe a little bit more, actually, I'm going to say I think that could go either way. Because I think it could be train 3 days a week if you just want kind of like full body management maintenance. But you could also say train 3 days a week if you are actually so specified that you are really hammering specific muscle
And
groups.
you don't need the volume for the other stuff. So
And you don't need the volume for
yeah.
the others. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Okay, anything else on the move towards the 3 days a week side of things?
Or if you're going through high periods of stress or like life shifts. Yeah.
Yep.
Or traveling on vacation.
Yeah. Big life responsibilities, kind of taking priority and slash or impeding recovery. Okay. So in what circumstances would somebody then train more towards the 5 days a week side of the scale or the spectrum?
Yeah, I think if you really want maximum physique development and you're serious about just overall physique development as a whole, and you have your recovery boxes checked, you have your systems in your life to organize work and family and social stuff, you have those in check, right? You have those systems, and you're prioritizing, fitness as high on your priority list. Because it's not really the 5 days a week that you have to think about. It's not like the time in itself. It's I got to do extra laundry because I'm training more frequently. At the time, this is a big part of energy that I'm giving to my sessions, right? So it's more of those things. It's not just, okay, I have to block off the hour of time.
Yeah, it's not that extra 1 or 2 hours in the gym. It's everything around it. And there's opportunity costs with that too, right? Yeah. If you are somebody who says the opportunity cost of me adding, let's say it's an hour and a half round trip to and from the gym, hit your session, etc. And then you've kind of got, okay, I've prepared my pre and post workout meals and now you're adding 20 minutes on either side of that. It's like, what else could you have done in that time? And if you're somebody who has all these other priorities that needed that attention of that time, then there's an opportunity cost. If you're not, 5 days a week training could make a lot of sense for you because you don't have those opportunity cost exchanges.
Yes. And it's also like, okay, maybe we could get 85% of the progress 4 days a week, and maybe we get 100% of the theoretical progress of the 5 days a week. Then it's like, okay, does that 15% really matter to you? Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe the answer is like, I'm okay just consistently at the 85% and just keep it going for a long time.
Yeah, admittedly, like I was going back and forth with my coach about like, should I switch to 5 days a week or stay at 4? And I said to him, I was like, I want to stay at 4 because right now, like I have other things that I want to experience on weekends. In the winter, we were doing a lot of snowboarding and I was like, okay, so I'm snowboarding 1 day a weekend. That's another like fatigue management thing. And also just, adjusting to this workflow of, doing the coaching work full time. I was like, I kind of want to make sure I'm maximizing my space to give it the push that it needs. So I stuck with 4 days because of that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about then different types of splits of how you can organize your training, because yes, it does matter if you are training 3, 4, 5 times a week. But at the same time, you kind of need to know, like, how are you going to structure your training program? And when I say structure or splits, what I'm referring to is how do you organize different muscle groups across those sessions? So we'll go through each of 3, 4, and 5. And I will preface by saying, doesn't mean any of these are the exact training program you need to follow. Yeah. Your exact training program should be highly, highly individualized for you, your goals, your priorities, your body. However, we want to give some starting points of, hey, maybe think about if you're training 3 days a week, here's how you could distribute that training. Yeah.
And there are pretty much an infinite amount of ways that you can organize your training through the week. We can give you some example splits here. But what you want to think about is, okay, we have enough frequency for muscle groups that we're trying to develop, at least 2 times a week. We have enough sets per week for that muscle group, which we could range anywhere between like 4 to 20 sets per week on average, depending on the muscle group and depending on the person. So once we check those boxes, there's a lot of different ways that we can do it. And then you also have to ask yourself, am I going for just overall development, or do I not? Again, maybe for some reason I have no care for my, I don't know, calves or whatever, right?
I knew
It's
you
like,
were going to
okay,
say calves.
yeah. So it's like, okay, well, that adds more opportunity for other things. So, it's just like knowing these factors. But as a blanket statement, we can give a few examples. So for 3 times per week, great options are like 3 full body days. That's
Yep.
a good one.
I will say, especially if you plan to do them on alternating days. So if you plan to do, like, let's say Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or, you're doing one day on, one day off, full body's great because you're also recovering all muscle groups in the time in between.
Yes, and it doesn't mean you have to hit every single muscle group. It just means you're hitting like multiple muscle groups in a
Yeah, yeah,
given
yeah,
session.
exactly. That would be a really, really long session if you're like, I'm going to hit every single
Every
muscle
single
group.
yeah, yeah. Just forearm curls at the end.
Yeah.
And then there's also like a full body pull push or something like that, or push pull, whatever you want to do. So it's like full body, and then the kind of anterior muscle groups: chest, shoulders, triceps, quads, abs, maybe, and then the more posterior focus: back, rear delt. That would be biceps, even though it's the front of your body, hamstrings, glutes, all posterior chain. So that's another option. And then maybe if you're a woman, you're prioritizing more lower body, you could do lower, upper, lower. And if you're a guy and you're prioritizing more upper body, you could do upper, lower, upper.
Yeah, exactly. So those are all great examples of like how you could start to think about organizing your training around 3 days a week. Let's think about 4. How does our training organization, training splits change when we are now have the opportunity of training 4 days a week? So we're adding a day in.
Yeah. So you could still do a full kind of thing, but you just have to watch if you're hitting back-to-back sessions that there's not overlapping. So it takes a little bit more of a puzzle piecing when you program that. Great split for both men and women is upper, lower, upper, lower. And you can kind of find some nuances within that. Push, pull is another great one. Kind of talking about the muscle groups I said before. Alternating push, pull, lower, upper. That's a great one as well. For guys, sometimes upper, lower, chest and back, arms and shoulders. That's a good one.
I ran upper, lower for actually years because you can also still find a lot of variation within an upper body
Yeah.
day, within a lower body day, right? So I loved that because it also allowed me to really like reorganize my week because not all my weeks look the same. And it meant that I could hit back-to-back sessions or I could space them out differently depending on my week. So I loved that about upper, lower, upper, lower. Right now I'm doing an lower, upper, lower, full. Right. And so that's also something that's allowing me to get, as a woman, you said sometimes we tend to prioritize a little bit more lower body volume. So I'm hitting lower body technically 3 times a week. But if I were doing full lower body sessions, that'd be really fatiguing. So having
Yes.
that like full session means I'm getting a little bit of volume, but then also still not neglecting some upper volume as well.
Nice. I like it.
Yeah. Okay. Example training splits now as we move into 5 days a week.
So 5 days. For guys, you could do upper, lower, upper, lower, upper. So 3 uppers, 2 lowers. And for girls, on the flip side, again, they usually prioritize lower body, 3 lowers and 2 uppers. So alternate lower, upper, lower, upper, lower. Another one is push, pull, legs, upper, lower. That's a great one. And for guys, upper, lower, chest and back, arms and shoulders, lower.
Yeah, I think when you're training 5 days a week, you can afford to spend a couple of those days more targeted towards designated muscle groups versus groups of muscle groups, right?
Yes.
Because you'll notice a lot of the language we're using is like upper body, lower body, push, pull. And so those are kind of groupings of muscular areas, I guess, muscle groups of groups. But when you have like 1 or 2 days, I'm going to say in excess, like if you're training, 5 days a week, you might get more targeted with like having a day that's designated, more specifically, like you said, to chest and arms or back and biceps, because you can add volume to those priority muscle groups in that way while still having like sufficient training volume for everything else.
Yeah. And again, there's a lot of other ones, but yeah.
Yeah. So I would say the 5 days a week one is the one that probably has the most variability to it.
Yeah.
But hopefully some of the examples you gave at least give a good starting point. And for you, because you're training 5 days a week, what does your current split look like?
Mine is a upper, lower, upper, lower, upper, but the uppers have different priorities depending on the day. Like for example, my first upper is pretty back dominant and delt dominant, but then my second upper is like chest and back dominant, and my third upper is pretty much arms and shoulders.
Okay.
So, and then even for my lowers, like the first one's more quad dominant a little bit, and then the second one's a little bit more posterior dominant, glutes and hammies. So that's why you could have a bajillion different variations even within the upper lower split, just based on how you organize. Yeah, it doesn't really
Yeah,
matter what it's called. It matters like how it's organized.
exactly. And our goal for today is just to get you thinking about the organizational structure and the potentials of that structure. But if you're somebody who's like, I really want to figure out how to actually, craft a program for me, drop a comment, reach out to us. That's what we're here to help do. Okay, we're going to wrap things up, I think. I think we covered everything else, unless there's anything else you want to add on like organizing 3, 4, or 5 day training splits for now.
I don't think so. I think the main thing is make it structured, and as we always say, have a training program, and you'd be surprised how much less training volume you think you need. Like start low on the volume first if you're getting started, and ramp your way up versus starting high and ramping your way down. I think like know how to maximize your sets first before you go to higher day splits and higher volume counts.
And ultimately, the main goal is figuring out what you can do consistently. And that is where having a training program is additionally helpful, because you're like, okay, this is what, there's no have to, but if you say, okay, this is what I'm striving to do, this is what I'm going to choose to feel like I have to do, then you can just plan for that. Versus saying like, okay, this week I can go 4 times this week, great. Next week I'm going to go 3 times, great. But having that structured, being like, determining how many days a week can you realistically train consistently based on the criteria we've outlined, structuring your split accordingly, and then just going for it. If you can't consistently hit at that level, then you can reevaluate in, let's say, a month or something if you're not hitting it. But I do think it is important to be like, set it, run it, and then go from there and kind of learn it.
Yeah. And I do want to say, as I mentioned before, but I'll bring it up one more time, is you need to have different splits in your back pocket for the different seasons of life. I'll bring that up because I do think it's important. Like, for example, I'm going to Greece June 10th or whatever. So my split is going to be, I think I'm going to train 4 times within a 10-day period when I'm there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to run 2 push days, 2 pull days. Whereas usually I'm training 5 days in a 7-day period.
Mm-hmm.
So I have that in my back pocket. So it's just kind of knowing what like is going on in your life and what season of life, and knowing it's not either I'm on a 6-day split or I'm doing nothing. It's this is the split that works given my goals, priorities, responsibilities, where I'm at.
Mm-hmm. And that starts with you. And it starts with like not you, the listener. Although you, Paris, have great experience doing that. Yeah, and I think it's just being able to flex. It is a skill. It is a skill to learn how to structure your training, and it is a skill to learn how to I'm going to just say it, how to kind of let go sometimes when you get used to training at that capacity. It's a skill to learn how to let go and accept that, hey, there are these seasons where we're just like maintaining,
Mm-hmm.
and there are these seasons when we might be pushing a little bit more.
Yeah, exactly. Every time I sit down in the program, I just wrote a program right before we hopped on, actually. It's like putting puzzle piece together. It's like, what do I know about this person? What other data do we have on them as well? And what variables do we need to manage? And then it's like we craft it from there. It's kind of like putting together a puzzle.
Yeah, it starts with the person and their life first and foremost. And that's the optimal training split. There is no single training split that is going to be like, this is the best thing out there.
Mm-hmm.
The optimal is what you can do consistently and what suits you, your lifestyle, and your goals.
Awesome.
All right. I think that's a good place to leave it off for now. All right, everyone. We'll leave you for this week, and we'll be back in your feeds next Monday with another episode of Truth Talks. We would love to know, how is your training currently organized? How many days a week are you training? What does your split look like? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear it. And if you have any additional thoughts on what factors you considered when determining your training split, feel free to add those in as well. All right, everyone. Without further ado, we'll see you next week. Bye for now.